Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we delve further into the wisdom of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply appreciate your support. Please take a moment to like and share this audiobook, helping us expand its reach and granting more individuals access to its profound insights. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can disseminate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner peace. Your participation in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible is truly invaluable. Let's begin today's reading. Harmlessness. September 25, 2015. When the Buddha denounced right resolve, he denounced it in three terms: resolve for renunciation, resolve for non-ill will, and resolve for harmlessness. The RST1 is obviously different from the other two. And the question often comes up, how are the other two different from each other? If you have ill will for someone, it's very close to wanting to see them harmed, wanting to do them harm. And there actually is a close relationship, but there is a distinction. Ill will is the opposite of goodwill. Harmfulness is the opposite of compassion. Goodwill is a general wish for happiness, for your own happiness and for others. Compassion is what you feel when you have goodwill for someone else, but you see that they're suffering or they're acting on the causes that would lead to suffering. This can apply to yourself as well as to other people. So it follows that ill will is a general desire to see someone suffer or to do things that will cause suffering. Harmfulness is more specific. You see somebody's down and you want to harm them. In other words, they're suffering, they're poor, they're in a position of weakness, and you want to take advantage of that weakness. That's what harmfulness is. So when we resolve on harmlessness, we don't pile on other people and we don't pile on ourselves. Sometimes when we're feeling weak in the practice, part of the mind will jump on us and say, that's a sign that you should give up. This doesn't necessarily mean giving up entirely, but just, say, giving up for tonight. You can start telling yourself all kinds of stories about how the meditation's not going well. You sit down. Your mind is all over the place and you tell yourself, gee, I shouldn't be meditating. My mind's a mess. That's harmfulness right there, that thought. And as Ajahn Lee once said, if you can do harm to your own goodness, it's very easy to let it spread out, and you start thinking about doing harm to other people's goodness, too. It's interesting that when the Buddha talks about benefiting others and harming them, it's not a question so much of what you do to them. It's what you get them to do that's going to make the difference between benefit and harm. If you get people to observe the precepts, that's for their benefit. If you try to dissuade them from practicing, if you try to tell them that the precepts don't have to be held to all the time, or there are times when it's just dead to kill or to lie or whatever, that's doing harm to those people. You've found them in a position of doubt or weakness, and you take advantage of that. So when we work on right resolve, we start RST by learning how to appreciate our own desire for happiness and doing what we cannot to harm that desire. We learn how to encourage ourselves, how to give ourselves the morale we need in order to practice. Being resolved on harmlessness for other people means that you try to encourage them, too, whenever it's appropriate. Now, there are a lot of times that people will not want to take your advice, in which case Ajahn Lee would say that if you continue to try giving them advice, it's a form of idle chatter. But if you can see that either through advice or through example, you can be a good influence on others, you're carrying out right resolve. The whole function of right resolve is to remind yourself that simply knowing about the Four Noble Truths, knowing about the teachings on karma, is not enough. These are types of knowledge that demand action. They point out possibilities and they also point out dangers. In other words, the possibilities for the good things that come from training your mind and developing your goodness, along with the dangers of not developing your goodness. Right resolve acts on that knowledge, realizing that it's meant to be a guide for action. Sometimes you develop goodwill for yourself and encourage yourself to practice, especially when you're down. This is when harmlessness comes in. You don't jump on the weakness or the discouragement or the times when you have no night to pull yourself further away from the path. Even when you have other responsibilities that don't allow you to be practicing all the time, you don't use them as an excuse not to practice. You try to end the little cracks in the time of the day, the openings where you can get the mind to settle down at least for a short spell of time. Give yourself meditation breaks here and there, and you end that once you've taken a break like that, and then you anticipate the next one, there's a possibility that you can make a link between the two to be with the breath all the time, continuously, as you're grounding. I received a phone call this evening from someone who asked, "How do I stick with the breath throughout the day? Do I just not care about other people? Do I not take in what they're saying?" I said, no, that's not the case at all. When you're with the breath, you're giving yourself a solid place to stand as you take on your other responsibilities. And you're actually more able to be sensitive to other people when the basis of your attention is your breath, rather than what it normally is. Your moods, your preoccupations. So you look for whatever opportunity there is to practice. There's a common phrase that you try to bring your practice into your life. Actually, it should be the other way around. You try to bring your life into the practice. In other words, the practice is the container. Your awareness of the breath should be the container for the day. And even when you can't focus entirely on the breath, or give it your 100% attention, you can still make it the framework. Even though you're aware of what's going on outside and you're responding to what's going on outside, you can still be aware of the breath energy in the body. It may be too much to ask of yourself to be conscious of in and out in the breath, but you can be attuned to simply the general quality of the breath energy. That's something you can sense immediately and deal with immediately, especially if you've been working in your formal meditation on how to breathe through tension in the body, breathe through blockages in the body, expand your awareness, expand the sense of the breath throughout the body. As you get better and better at that skill, it doesn't take all that much to bring it into the rest of your life. And if you do it well, you end that, yes, it is a grounding. It does provide you with a good foundation. That way, your breath is the container for the rest of your life, as it should be. After all, without the breath, you wouldn't be dealing with anything at all, doing anything at all, having any contact with the outside world at all. You'd be dead. So spread your awareness around a larger awareness, a larger sense of what you can do. And this is how you have goodwill for yourself. This is how you have compassion for yourself. You hold yourself to a higher standard, realizing that you have these potentials. If you deny the potentials, if you put them down, you're treating yourself in a harmful way. So an important part of the path is learning how to keep yourself encouraged, to give yourself the morale to stick with the path, to stick with the practice even when it gets difficult, even when you seem to be backsliding in terms of the results. Make sure at least that the causes don't backslide, because, after all, the mind is a complex phenomenon. There's not just one mind in there. There are many minds with lots of different agendas, lots of different attitudes. Sometimes you can deal with one mind and everything seems to calm down. But tomorrow another comes up. It's not that you've been defeated by the RST one. It's just that another one has come moving in. It's like a large organization, a big bureaucracy or a big corporation, and everybody's ring emails at one another all the time. You can take care of some of the unskillful emails from some quarters, and that seems to calm things down, but then tomorrow, another faction will come up with theirs. Well, don't be surprised. Don't get discouraged. It's going to take a while to clean out the whole corporate culture inside here. So when you think about the principles of non-ill will and harmlessness, remember that you should be the beneficiary of them, along with other people. You don't want to harm yourself. Again, keep that point from imaginally in mind. If you harm your own goodness, it's very easy to harm other people. So maintain your goodness. Regard it as your most precious possession. The Buddha talks about protecting your goodwill as a mother would protect her only child. Well, try to protect all your goodness in the same way, because it's all you've got. The Samsaric Mud Fight. December 27, 2014. The question came up yesterday about the difference between Mahayana and Theravada. And one of the important differences is how they view samsara. For the Mahayana, samsara is a place. And because it's a place, if someone does a lot of good, develops a lot of good qualities, and then leaves that place, that person is leaving everybody else in a lurch, which is why they say that the truly generous and compassionate person wants to hang around, doesn't want to leave samsara. In fact, they deny samsara as being identical with nibbana if, they say, you look at it the right way. That way the bodhisattva gets to be in samsara and nibbana at the same time. But the early teachings don't treat samsara as a place. They treat it as a process. Samsara literally means the wandering on. It's an activity. A process. And you don't just wander. You create the worlds that you wander into. They involve feeding, and that's addictive. So samsara is basically a bad habit, where you have an idea. You'd like to have this kind of pleasure, but no matter what it is, it's going to cost a certain amount of suffering both for yourself and for other people in the worlds you create around that desire. This is why stopping the process, stopping the addictive habit, is actually good for yourself and for those others. And this is why samsara and nibbana can't be the same thing, because samsara is an addiction, and you can't stop the addiction. The stopping is nibbana while still indulging in it. Stopping your own addiction is good for others for two reasons. On the one hand, you're giving a good example. On the other hand, you're taking one more person out of this addictive process, one more person out of the feeding chain. So the idea that you would want to wait until everybody else got over their addiction before you're willing to give up your addiction doesn't make any sense. We could view samsara as a big mud GHT. I splash mud on you. You splash mud on me. And then I splash mud on you back because you splashed mud on me. It goes back and forth like this and it never ends. So the idea of trying to straighten everybody out or trying to settle the score, again, makes no sense. There's that famous story of Samdito. A junior monk came to see him once, complaining that another monk had hit him over the head for no reason at all. He hadn't done anything to harm the other monk. The other monk was just a really bad guy who came up and hit him. And Samdito said, "Well, you hit him RST." The junior monk replied, No, he came up and hit me RST. I didn't do anything to him at all." Samdito kept insisting, "No, you hit him RST." And so the young monk went to complain to Samdito's superior, who must have been the supreme patriarch. He went to Samdito to question him about this. Why did you keep insisting that the innocent monk had hit the other monk RST? And Samdito said, "Well, it's karma. If this monk had never hit that other monk, maybe in some other lifetime, he wouldn't have been hit back." The idea of settling scores makes sense if you have a clear beginning point and a clear end point. But when the beginning point, as the Buddha said, cannot be found, can't even be conceived, how are you going to figure out what the score is? Where would you begin the tally? This is a useful point to think about when old wrongs come up in your meditation. You start thinking about events in your past. People who abused you, people who did horrible things to you, or people who are still doing horrible things to you now. You have to ask yourself, well, maybe I've done something to that person. That doesn't exonerate the other person. It simply means that the two of you have been entangled in this mud GHT, back and forth, and you don't know when it began. So the best thing is to say, okay, I'm just going to not continue the back and forth. Wish the other person well. If reconciliation is possible, try for reconciliation. If it's not, you go for forgiveness, because you realize that not every score is going to get settled, but you can pull out of the mud GHT, even when it seems like the other person is winning unfairly. In any mud GHT, the question of who splashed more mud on the other person after a while becomes really irrelevant. It's not the kind of score you want to keep, a score you want to settle. It's a GHT you want to get out of. There's a passage where the chief of the Asuras says, if other people see you being restrained while they abuse you, they'll think you're weak, and that might make them abuse you even more. And Saka, the Deva king, replies, no. You can't look after the other person's behavior. You have to look after your own. The only way this back and forth can stop is if you stop. See that their words and actions don't really touch you, at least they don't touch your goodness. Then it's as if somebody throws something dirty at you and it falls at your feet. Well, just leave it there. Don't pick it up and throw it back, for otherwise the dirt will now be on your hand. One of the skills we need to develop as we meditate is to learn how to see these things as not hitting us. They just go right past, right past. The words go past. Even if the other person hits your body, the body's not you. That's one of the good uses of the not-self strategy. It's just a body. You have an awareness that's separate from that, that's not besmirched by that. The only thing that can besmirch your awareness is what you do. So when things like this come up in your meditation, you realize, okay, this has been a back and forth that it's best to get out of. It's a process. Remember, we're not here in a place where we're trying to establish a just or paradisiacal society, or even a fair society. We're entangled in a bad process, and the wisest, most compassionate thing is to get out and to show other people that they can get out, too. You have to realize that you're not the only person who's been involved in this kind of behavior. Everybody has been involved in a back and forth to some extent, if not precisely the way you've been involved, they've got their own involvements. It's up to you to decide. You have the freedom to decide. If you want to GHT for other people to help get them out of this kind of situation, make that your gift to humanity. That's your choice. It can be a form of generosity. But you have to realize that people have their choices, too. They can choose to follow along with your idea of what's good, or they can choose not to. The Buddha never said that we're here to clean up the mud GHT. We're here to get out of the mud GHT. And your idea of how things should be. That's what a lot of the mud GHTs are all about, how to redress old wrongs. When you've had enough of the mud, there comes a point when you have to realize that the Buddha was right. The best course of action is to get out for the two reasons I mentioned. One is that you're no longer oppressing the other person, so you're no longer creating bad karma for yourself. And two, you can set a good example for other people. Now, they have the right to choose to be inspired by your example or not. You can't control that. But what you can control is the kind of example you set. So you have the choice. Are you going to be the sort of person whose life is totally ruined by something that someone else did or is continuing to do? Or are you going to learn how to step outside, step to the side, and say, okay, those things happened. Who knows when it started, but I don't have to be directly involved anymore. I don't have to keep identifying with the GHT, identifying with my role in the GHT, identifying with my avatar that I've designed here. And then you drop the whole thing. Now some mud may continue to come back at you for a while, rebounding from your old karma, but there comes a point where it ends. In the meantime, you've created one more stellar example. It's like black holes, which are surrounded by dazzling light. Things leaving the rest of the universe and going into the black hole release enormous amounts of light. In the same way, in creating a good example, you create a lot of light for the world. And that's actually a gift. Getting out of the process is a gift. We're involved in this addictive process. And the best way you can put an end to it is to end your addiction. Then, if you have the time and the energy and the talent, you help give information to other people on how they can do the same. That's how compassion really works, both for yourself and for the world around you. Justice versus skillfulness. July 31, 2016. When we develop the Brahma Viharas attitudes of goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity, we try to make them unlimited. In other words, we develop goodwill for all beings, compassion for all, empathetic joy for all, and we have to learn how to apply thoughts of equanimity to all when necessary. The problem is that although our attitudes may be unlimited, our resources for actually helping people and improving the world are not. This is why we need a clear set of priorities as to what we can do, what we can't do, what things are worth doing, worth improving, what things are not, because if you spread yourself too thin, you end up not accomplishing much at all. Or If you focus on solving the wrong problems, you end up regretting it later. For example, sometimes we're told that the Buddha's main purpose in teaching was to put an end to all suffering. Well, yes, but his approach to accomplishing that end was very specific. Instead of running around trying to right all the sufferings caused by the injustices of the world or the structure of society, he focused on one type of suffering. The suffering we each cause ourselves, through our own craving, through our own clinging, through our own ignorance. When we put an end to that suffering, we don't suffer from anything outside at all. But the problem has to be solved from within, which is why he never said that the whole world, or half the world, or whatever, would put an end to suffering. He simply taught the way. It's up to each of us to follow it. And none of us can follow it for anyone else. As for the suffering that comes from the three characteristics, that's something that can't be stopped. Those characteristics are still going to keep on manifesting themselves in the world. The question is, do you have to suffer from them? Does your mind have to suffer from them? And the answer is no. So the focus is specifically on how the way you engage with the world is causing suffering through your engagement, through clinging and craving and ignorance. That's what we work on as we meditate. As for helping other people, that's a matter of generosity. The Buddha set out duties only in terms of the Four Noble Truths. As for the issue of helping other people, he didn't place a duty on anyone. He pointed out the advantages of being generous, but he didn't try to force anyone in that direction. He simply pointed out that certain things are skillful and certain things are unskillful in your engagement with other people, and it's up to you to choose what you want to do, realizing the consequences that will come from your choices. And it's important to note that the main emphasis is on what's skillful and not. This is indicated in the set of questions that the Buddha says lies at the beginning of discernment. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? What is skillful? What is blameless? Those are the questions on the positive side. Then on the negative side. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term harm and suffering? What is unskillful? What is blameworthy? Notice the terms of the questions. There's never a question, what is justice? The question is, what is skillful? When you look at the world around you, you see a lot of injustices. You see a lot of mistreatment of people and animals. But are we going to deal with it primarily as an issue of injustice, or as an instance of unskillful actions? Our idea of justice is based on the idea that there's a beginning point to a story. From that point, you gure out who did what first, and then who did what second, and then at the end of the story you tally up how things should be apportioned in terms of guilt or lack of guilt, based on which actions were justified by what went before, and which ones weren't, so as to bring things into a proper balance. But in the Buddha's vision of time, there's no beginning. As he said, you could trace back, and not end a conceivable beginning. The beginning point, he said, is inconceivable. Not just unknowable, inconceivable. You can't even think it. We've been through the ups and downs of time so many times, through so many universes, that, as he said, it's hard to meet someone who hasn't been your mother or your father or your brother or your sister or your son or your daughter in all that time. The stories are very long. So if you're going to start apportioning blame and trying to bring things into balance, where do you start? There's a famous story concerning Samdito. A young monk once came to him to complain that another monk had hit him, and Samdito said, "Well, you hit him first." The monk replied, No, he just came up and hit me over the head, and I hadn't done anything at all." Samdito said, "No, you hit him first." They went back and forth like this for a while, and then the young monk got upset and went to see another senior monk to complain about Samdito. So the other senior monk came and asked Samdito what was up, and Samdito replied, "Well, obviously it's his karma from some previous lifetime. He had hit the other monk first at some point in time. And, of course, that might have been after the other monk had hit the monk first, so it goes back and forth like this." So when you see mistreatment around you, the RST question isn't, is this just or unjust? The question is the person dishing out the mistreatment behaving in a skillful way or unskillful way, and what can I do, behaving skillfully, to put a stop to unskillful behavior? Now there's some unskillful behavior you can stop, and other unskillful behavior that you can't. The kinds you can't stop are the cases where someone's karma, your own or the other's, gets in the way. But the basic question is this: when is it skillful to interfere, when is it skillful to get involved, and what kind of interference would be skillful? What would be a wise way to be generous, virtuous, or to show goodwill? In other words, what would be a skillful way to alleviate the problem through acts of merit? Sometimes the answer is clear and sometimes it's not. If you have the energy and the wherewithal and it's not too dangerous, you try to help. Then, if you see that it's not working, you pull back. But a lot of this also has to do with your priorities. There are some unskillful things happening in the world that really are worth banding together with other people, getting your energies together, and seeing if you can put a stop to them. But you have to do it in a skillful way. There's never a case in the Dhamma where good ends justify unskillful means. The means have to be good. In fact, everything is all means. After all, where would you put the ends? You settle one issue and there's another issue. You settle that issue, then everyone dies, they get reborn, and things start up again. We don't have the closure of anal judgment. The only real closure in the Buddha's teachings is nibbana, and that's a closure that each of us has to ND within ourselves. We're not going to ND closure out in the world, because the nature of the world is that everything falls apart, even the best things, and then gets reconfigured again and again, around and around and around. Even at the beginning of each cycle in the universe, there's not just one beginning. The Buddha has several ways of describing how the universe starts to evolve. There's no one person behind the evolution, no one plan behind the evolution. There are just lots of individuals with lots of plans, and they're driven mainly by craving and ignorance. That's what keeps the whole thing going. As long as you're trying to straighten things out outside, your attempts are dealing in craving and ignorance. Sometimes it's other people's craving and ignorance, sometimes it's yours. Your ideas of a just resolution, their ideas of a just resolution, contain a lot of ignorance. In fact, most of the problems of the world come when people's ideas of justice connect. One side tries to impose its ideas of justice on another side, which has its own different ideas of justice, and they can believe so strongly in their ideas of justice that they're willing to kill to get them imposed. This is where a lot of fanaticism comes from. So you have to be very careful around this issue. This is why we work on the mind, because only in the mind can closure come. Meanwhile, outside, the main question is not an issue of justice or injustice. The issue is this particular action I'm contemplating doing skillful or unskillful? The Buddha never tries to justify, say, oppression by saying that the oppressed people deserved it. The word deserve also doesn't appear in the Buddha's teachings, aside from the statement that arahants are deserving of O-rings. In fact, that's what arahant means. Deserving. Until we reach that point, there are simply skillful actions with good results and unskillful actions with bad results, and we all have a big mix of both. So when you see somebody sewering, you don't know which part of that person's mix is showing, and how much good stewa, say, is not showing. The part that's not showing is what gives the potential for you to help them. In other cases, it's clear that you can't help. Like the squirrel I saw yesterday. Something was obviously wrong with one of its legs or maybe two of its legs, but the closer I got to it to see what was wrong, the more it tried to struggle and struggle to get away from me. I realized that my concern was causing it a lot of sewering. So I had to back away. That's the kind of situation where you obviously can't help. But other situations are not quite so easy to see. The important thing is to remember the categories. It's not about ends. It's about means. It's not about just or unjust ends. It's about skillful or unskillful means. That way, we can live with one another and with ourselves. When there's unskillful behavior outside, at the very least you don't condone it. You don't encourage people to engage in killing or stealing or lying, no matter how you glorify the ends to which that behavior could lead in the short term. And if you can think up some skillful way to stop unskillful behavior, you try. But your primary responsibility is what you're genuinely responsible for, i.e., your own choices, what you do and what you choose to tell other people to do. Make sure that those choices are skillful. If everybody looked after this one issue, the world would settle down. Our problem is we're trying to straighten everybody else out by imposing our ideas of justice without straightening ourselves out. This is why we have to develop equanimity in addition to goodwill, because there are cases where, because of karmic obstacles, past or present, we can't help. After all, for people to be happy, they have to create the causes for happiness. You can help them by encouraging them to be skillful, but the choice of whether or not to follow your advice and example is theirs. As for the unclear cases where you're not sure whether you can help, you have to keep your priorities straight. What are the most important things for you to do? Where do you want to focus your energies to make a difference in the world? In other words, where do you want to choose to be generous? As the Buddha said, with generosity there are no shoulds, there's no imposition. He simply recommended that you give where you feel inspired, where you feel the gift would be well used. That applies not only to material gifts, but also to gifts of your time, gifts of your energy to improve things in the world. It's up to you to decide where you want to make your mark, who you want to help, realizing that once you've chosen that, there are other things you're going to have to put aside. If your energies get too scattered, the Thai phrase is that you take a container of pepper sauce and pour it into the sea. There's so much water in the sea that the pepper sauce makes no difference at all. This is why we have to practice equanimity. We have goodwill for all, but we have to realize that we can be helpful only in certain circumstances, and we have to be very careful about when our efforts at help are skillful and when they're not. Make sure that those are the terms of your analysis. Once you keep that point straight in your mind, then it clears up a lot of other difficulties. Now, our society doesn't think in these ways. Most people think in the terms of a story with a beginning and an end, where it's clear to them who's right and who's wrong. We argue over the details, especially about what's relevant to the story and what's not. That's why there's so much conflict. But everybody seems to have the idea that there's a beginning point and an end point, and a plan to all this, and that there's somebody up there who's got an idea about a just way to arrange things and assigns us duties. But that's not in the Buddha's universe at all. There's no clear end, no clear beginning, and there's no one in charge. As that passage also says, the world is swept away. Just make sure you don't get swept away with it. Try to be clear about what you're doing, clear about doing it skillfully. That's how you come to closure. That's how you get out. This is what the practice is all about. Getting out. We try to leave some good things behind as we get out. In fact, you can't get out without leaving some good things behind, in terms of your generosity, virtue, and goodwill. But sometimes the best gift you can give to other people is simply to show them that there is a way out that they can follow, too. Try to keep that way open as much as you can through being skillful in your thoughts and your words and your deeds. Look at the Buddha. He gave the greatest gift of all. He gave us the Dhamma, showed us the path, and then he left. Now it's up to us to give that gift to ourselves and to the people around us as best we can. Inner refuge through inner strength. June 11, 2016. When we were in Brazil, someone asked why sitting along with a guided meditation got much better results than sitting there meditating on your own, even in a group, in the presence of the teacher. My answer was basically that the person giving the guided meditation is doing a lot of your work for you. In other words, the instructions are doing what your mindfulness should be doing. That's why, although it may be useful to have a couple of guided meditations every now and then, there comes a point where you have to do the work yourself. Nobody else can make you mindful. No one can make you awakened. Someone once asked the Buddha, "Please remove my doubts." And the Buddha said, I can't remove anybody's doubts. You have to remove your own doubts. So we've got the instructions, and it's up to you to remember the instructions and to carry them out. You focus on the breath, try to stay with the breath as much as you can. If you need a meditation word to help, use Buddha, which means awake, or you can just do in and out anything that helps you stay with the breath. Then, when you can stay with the breath, you can drop the meditation word. And the more continually you can stay with the breath, the more you begin to notice where the breath is rough or uneven or too long or too short. You can make adjustments. Try to make your attention on the breath steady and constant, and that will help smooth out the breath. As for whether long breathing feels good or short breathing feels better, that's up to you to decide. You develop not only your mindfulness, i.e., your ability to keep things in mind, but also your powers of judgment as to what's working, what's not working, how to compare. The more you meditate, the more you have to depend on your own powers of judgment, persistence, discernment. And this is what the meditation is for, to teach you how to depend on yourself, how to become your own refuge. We talk about how we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, both on the internal and external levels. On the external level, you're inspired by the story of the Buddha, inspired by his teachings, inspired by the Dhamma, and inspired by the example of the noble Sangha. We take these people as examples for how we should live. As I was saying today in class, try to live your life in such a way that if people read about your life, they would be inspired. Not that you're showing oa, but just keep that in mind, that you're setting an example for others, too, as you act. You see the good example that the Buddha has set, the good teachings he has given us, the good example of the noble Sangha, and one way of expressing gratitude for that is to try to pass on that example. But more important than that is for our own sake, for our own strength, we want to take them as examples, so that we can depend on ourselves. As for other people, whether they take you as an example or not, that doesn't lie within your power. There's no way you can force them. And even if they don't take you as an example, your practice is not wasted, because you have taken care of your own true responsibility. Now, the question is, how do you take the example of the triple gem and turn it into a refuge inside? That's what the teachings on the V-strengths are about. V-steps by which you internalize the qualities of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and make them your own refuge. All these steps build on heedfulness. You realize that if you can't depend on yourself, you're living in a dangerous world, because even your act of taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha becomes uncertain. Some days you take them as examples, other days you live as if they never existed. Sometimes the change is not from day to day. It can even be from moment to moment. This is scary. So you've got work to do. There are dangers here inside the mind, and there are dangers outside. But the dangers inside the mind are important ones. Keep that thought as your motivation, and then, based on that, develop the V-strengths. The RST is conviction in the Buddha's awakening, the three knowledges he gained on the night of his awakening, and most importantly the knowledge he gained about karma. That actions have results, and that the results depend on the intentions inspiring the action and the skill with which you carry it out. And you really do have the choice. You have the choice to change the way you're acting. You've got to have that conviction, that you have it within you. If you see that you're doing something unskillful, you can guru out how to change. It's a possibility, which means that you're also convinced that you've got it within you to carry it through. If you don't have that conviction in yourself in addition to the conviction in the Buddha, the practice is not going to work. You run up against an obstacle and you just run away. As Ajahn Lee said, it's like digging down into the ground to nd the gold there, but RST you run into a big rock. Some people, when they hit the rock, just throw away their shovels and run oa. But if you're convinced that the gold is there and you can nd it, you'll be able to nd some way of getting through the rock or around it. Years back when we were getting ready to build the chiti at Wat Dhammasathat, we had to bring in some people to put some dynamite in the rock in the mountain. They had no fancy equipment, just a spike and a hammer, that was it. They would tap, tap, tap lightly on the rock, and then turn the spike a bit, and then tap, tap, tap. And I kept thinking to myself, these people will never get anywhere into the rock. But, sure enough, I came back 2 hours later, and they had gotten a couple of feet into the rock. Just tap, tap, tap. It was the consistency of their ear that got them through the rock along with their conviction. They had seen in the past that it had worked, so they just kept at it. So you're going to need that kind of conviction. It may seem that not much is changing from day to day, but over time, you get deeper and deeper through the rock, until now there is gold on the other side. So conviction is what gives you a sense that your own actions are important, and if you have any unskillful qualities, you have the ability to change that. Building on that conviction is persistence. The ear to develop what's skillful and abandon what's not. But it's more than just eart. As the Buddha said, an important part of right eart is generating desire, your motivation. You have to keep reminding yourself why you want to do this. You're not doing this because somebody else tells you. You're nobody's servant. This is your own choice. And you choose it not because you can't do anything else, but because it's inherently good. That was another one of the questions that came up in Brazil. I was asked, so why did you ordain? What went wrong in your life? And all the monks laughed. As I answered, it was something that went very right. I found a path that I could really give my whole heart to. And so whatever motivation keeps you on the path, try to develop that. Goodwill is an important one. Goodwill is a strength that you can generate from within. It's your protection. It can protect you from yourself, and it can often protect you from other people. If you're radiating goodwill, people feel less threatened by you. At the same time, you're less of a threat to yourself. You're much less likely to do harmful things. You want to remind yourself, okay, I want to act in a way that harms nobody. And it is possible, and it warms your heart. That gives you energy for the practice. You can motivate yourself with heedfulness. You can motivate yourself with a sense of pride that you don't want to stoop to anything low, that you want to do something noble with your life. That's a perfectly legitimate motivation. There is also a sense of shame that comes with that pride, that you would be ashamed to even think about doing something beneath you. So you let it go. This means that persistence is not just chipping away. It's also giving yourself the juice you need to keep going. That you're doing it because it's good and you want to do it. And then, building on this persistence, you develop the other 3 strengths, beginning with mindfulness. The ability to keep something in mind. In this case, you keep in mind all the instructions you've received and the lessons you've learned from your own practice that are helpful for whatever particular step of the practice you're doing at that point. For instance, as you're sitting here meditating, you don't have to think about generosity or virtue too much, except when you end that it gives you strength. Your sole concern right now is to remember that you want to be with the breath. And you keep reminding yourself that you want to stay here. Together with mindfulness, there's alertness. You watch to make sure that you really are doing this. This is a strength because it keeps you from wandering off and losing your focus. And as you focus in on the breath, you end that your steady focus does change the quality of the breath along with the quality of your experience of the body. If it's skillful, it gives rise to a greater sense of well-being. This is how mindfulness begins to shade into the next strength, which is concentration. You stay consistently focused with the breath. Tudana concentration, the Buddha uses the word ekaggata, which can be translated as being one-pointed, but also can mean having one gathering place. In other places, he describes concentration as whole body awareness, so it's more likely that in this case it means that everything in the mind is gathered around one topic. The sense of the body, the sense of the breath as you breathe in and out, and a sense of the more subtle levels of breath energy that course through the body. You learn to develop a sense of well-being, a sense of refreshment with the breath that LLS the whole body. This refreshment, when you gain it, really helps with your conviction and your persistence. It's not the case that, as you develop these strengths, you develop one and then drop it and then go on to the next, or that only the RST one helps the second one, which helps the third one. They all help one another. Concentration, in particular, helps with your conviction, your persistence, and your mindfulness. As the Buddha says, mindfulness doesn't become pure until the fourth jhana, which is a fairly advanced stage in concentration. So as you're focusing here on the breath, once there is a sense of ease, think of that ease spreading through different parts of the body. In the beginning, it may not go everywhere, but allow it to go wherever it can now easily. And in the same way that allowing water into a channel widens the channel as more and more water goes through, that the more the breath runs through the body, the breath energy channels widen and grow more inclusive, spreading more and more to the body as a whole. As you're doing this form of evaluation, you develop the now strength, which is discernment. You see what's working, what's not working. It's not just on the basis of what you've heard, it's on the basis of what you're actually doing. As you learn to adjust things, you begin to see which ways of breathing are more pleasurable, which ways of breathing help you stay with the breath more easily, which ways of focusing the mind and where you focus the mind have the best impact. As you see that connection between cause and effect, that's the beginning of discernment. Then you take that insight and start applying it to other areas where you're causing suffering. You begin to have a place where you can stand here in the concentration, so that you can step back from the other ways of your mind and observe them more objectively. This particular habit is not useful. I've got to change. Other people seem to be doing better here. Can I watch their example without feeling jealous or lessened by the fact that they are more skillful than I am? As Ajahn Lee said, his attitude when going to a new place was to look to see what they were doing well that he hadn't done well yet, and to learn from them. But if there was some area where he knew more than they did, he would be happy to share his knowledge. But the RST point is really important, especially when you're on the path. You want to see, what do other people do more skillfully than me? Can I learn from their example? And as you develop your other strengths, you feel content that you can. So it's through these strengths that you turn yourself into your own refuge. You take the example of the Buddha, and it becomes the example for your own life. So instead of having to depend on someone from outside, you've got the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha inside, where it really counts. Then as you make yourself a refuge like this, that you can be an external refuge to others. That's how the gift of refuge gets passed on. Living honorably. April 24, 2015. As someone once said, one of the most amazing things about human beings is that they know they're going to die, and yet they act as if they don't know. In fact, they try to push that awareness out of their minds because for most people, it's too depressing a thought. They don't know how to handle it, so they push it away. One of the marks of wisdom is that you don't push it away. You try to figure out how to live in the presence of the possibility of death. The canon has two very striking images in this regard. One is the image that came to the Buddha when he was still a young prince. He saw life as a dwindling stream. The waters running out in the sh are just hopping around, struggling with one another, pushing one another out of the way to get to that last little bit of water. And then, of course, they're all going to die. The water's going to run out. So all that thing is for nothing. It's like the time I saw spawning salmon in a little stream up in British Columbia a couple of years ago. The water was only an inch or two deep, and the salmon were struggling up the stream, ting one another for the water, trying to get past the seagulls at the beach, who were waiting to poke their eyes out. Then making it into the woods where they had to dip themselves over dead salmon to get to that last little bit of water. In the meantime, there were bears in the woods just waiting to scoop them up. It's not a very inspiring sight. In fact, that was the image that gave the Buddha a sense of samvega. It could be translated as terror, dismay at being trapped in all this suffering, and wanting to see a way out. That's one image. The other image is the one that comes from a story concerning King Pasenadi. King Pasenadi comes to see the Buddha in the middle of the day, and the Buddha asks him, "Where are you coming from in the middle of the day?" And the king, in a remarkable display of frankness, says, "Oh, I've been with my ministers engaging in the sorts of things that people who are obsessed with power, drunk with their power, do from day to day? And the Buddha asks him, suppose someone reliable were to come to you from the east, saying that there was an enormous mountain moving in from the east, crushing all living beings in its path. Another reliable person comes from the south and reports that there's a mountain moving in from the south. Another person comes from the west. There's a mountain moving in from the west, crushing all living beings, and another mountain coming from the north, altogether 4 mountains moving in. He then asks, considering that human life is so precious and hard to obtain, what would you do? The king replies, what else could I do but calm my mind and practice the Dhamma? And then the Buddha says, okay, I announce to you that aging, illness, death, and separation are moving in, crushing living beings in their path. What are you going to do? The king says, what else? Calm my mind and practice the Dhamma. The second image is by far the more honorable one. The fact of death is there in both images, but in the RST one, everybody is still struggling for that last little bit that's not going to do them any good. And in the second, people are doing good things that they can take with them after they die, qualities of mind behaving honorably in the face of death. That's what we want to do as we practice. You look in the newspapers and it seems like everything in the world is falling apart. And it is. So, what is there to accomplish? We train our minds. We're good to one another, because that kind of goodness isn't erased by death. As the Buddha said, the beginning of wisdom is when you ND someone who's knowledgeable and ask that person, what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? That's the question. That question is, in the Buddha's terms, an expression of appropriate attention. He has an interesting analysis of attention. He's not talking about bare attention just sitting there, passively watching things arise and pass away, as if you're in a drugged state. To pay attention to life means to ask questions. Appropriate attention is when you start asking the right questions. And this is a good one to begin with. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? Long-term here is important. You want long-term rather than short-term happiness. That's part of the wisdom. The other part is that happiness depends on your actions, what you do, what you say, what you think. From that principle, you can derive a lot of the Buddha's teachings. He talks about 3 perceptions, or what are often called the 3 characteristics. Yet the Buddha teaches them as perceptions. They're perceptions for testing things. To gauge if something you're focusing on is really worth taking as a goal, if it's really an answer to the question of discernment. The RST test is that if it's not constant, it's not going to be trustworthy. It's not going to be long-term. Is it stressful? If it's stressful, it's not going to be happiness. And if it's stressful and not happiness, why would you want to claim it as mine? That's anatta, not self. But you could also apply the Buddha's underlying question to other parts of the teachings, such as the 4 Noble Truths. Stress and suffering are the problem, and you've got to do something to ND a long-term solution. The Buddha's RST recommendations are to comprehend suffering and abandon its cause. So how are you going to guru out a way to sit with the suffering long enough to comprehend it and detect the cause? The cause for the suffering that's weighing your mind down is coming from within. That's the really important point. We tend to blame people outside for our suffering. And while it is true that they can provide plenty of material with which we can make ourselves suffer, the actual putting together of the suffering and causing it, that comes from something inside the mind itself. To see that, to comprehend that suffering and to abandon the cause, you've got to develop strength. This is why we're meditating, to gain the strength of mind that comes from mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. These are the things that give you the strength to deal with these problems. As long as the mindfulness and concentration are not yet strong, you need other forms of strength, such as conviction and persistence. You're convinced that this has got to be the way out, this has got to be the way to behave, and this is the noble way to look for happiness. You have to ask yourself, are you going to go like the king or are you going to go like the SH? If you look inside, you're not ting with others over the water. You're looking inside for the cause of the problem, and you ND that you've got the means for the solution inside as well, so that you don't have to keep on coming back again and again and again to worlds where the water is running out and mountains are moving in. This path does offer a way out. In the meantime, you're not harming anybody, and you're providing yourself with denied wealth, denied strength, denied treasures, as we often say in Thailand, that last beyond death. In other words, you treat the world around you in full knowledge that it's going to die, but you treat the quality of your mind as something that doesn't die. That's what gives honor to what you're doing. It's what makes this a noble path. So pay attention. Ask the right questions of yourself. Where is the cause of the suffering here? Look for it inside. This is not meant to blame you for the suffering. I mean, everybody's doing it. And it's not to say that there aren't other people out there who are misbehaving. They really are, sometimes in horrible ways. But the question is, do you have to make yourself suffer over that? Do you want to? The Buddha's offering you a skill for how not to suffer. You look for the cause inside. You develop the strengths inside. The potential is there within all of us. We can develop these strengths. When the Buddha talked about the qualities that led to his awakening, one was resoluteness. He made up his mind that this was something he really wanted to do. Another was ardency. Another was heedfulness. He didn't have a monopoly on those qualities. When he started out, he was pretty much like us, with strengths and weaknesses. He took his human qualities, though, and he strengthened them. He found strength by being with good people, getting good advice. But then he realized that he had to do the work himself. This is true for all of us. We want to be able to depend on the people around us, yet we can depend on them only up to a certain extent. Beyond that, it's our work. But it's good work to do. This is a path that's noble not only in the end. It's noble all the way through. All the qualities the Buddha has you develop are good qualities. There's nothing sneaky about the path, nothing cut rate. It's a solid, dependable path. It's a safe path, even though ultimate safety doesn't come until the end. Still, the fact that we're doing things that are not harming ourselves and not harming other people, there's a safety in that. So remember, we have the choice as to how we're going to face the fact of death. Are we going to go out like SH? Or are we going to go out like kings? Or are we going to go out like the Buddha? The Buddha shows you how to go out like a Buddha, maybe not a full Buddha, but at least someone who has the purity of mind that the Buddha developed, along with the wisdom and the compassion. The choice is just laid there before us. So take advantage of your freedom to choose. In alignment with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the tremendous significance of sharing wisdom widely. At present, we've converted this extensive 1,000-page work into a user-friendly audio format. The responsibility to advance this noble endeavor now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's continue the age-old tradition of knowledge dissemination and the nurturing of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this undertaking, and together, we can effect profound and positive changes in the lives of many.